This is the day when Dr. John Henry Clarke destroyed these two historians, and while they were giving their Eurocentric view, Dr. John Henry Clarke gave them an Afrocentric view, which makes sense, and he backed it up with a lot of evidences, with a lot of empiricism, with a lot of research that really backed up the point to the extent that they didn't have nothing to argue about. Now, all of these videos that I'm always trying to do is always try to educate fellow black folks or brown folks, or people call themselves black folks around the world, melanated people around the world. Now, another crucial thing that you need to know, most of us melanated people, we lived in a society that was really whitewashed. And when we lived in a society that was really whitewashed, people took credit of what black people did, the achievements of black people did, to the extent that things like ancient Egypt, some people with Eurocentric views, like these two professors, claimed that black people got nothing with the ancient Egypt that came with civilization, right? And people know the truth, that this is not the truth. And hey, I don't want to say much, because this is going to be a spectacular Throwback Friday that we are going to watch, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves where we melanated people have come from the longest time, from the shackles of histories that was hidden, from the shackles of history that was rated in white man's favor, making black people suffer at the expense of making themselves look rich, making themselves look messiah. Hey, I don't want to say much. This will be so interesting video that I want us to watch. And if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to what we can offer you. So until then, let's dive right into the video. I'll be back and we'll have a proper discussion about it.
I came to this subject before I was 10 as a Baptist Sunday school teacher. I wanted to teach junior class in Sunday school, so I learned to read very early. What baffled me from the beginning was the Bible itself. I could not find my people in a book that's supposed to be about all mankind. And what called my attention to the neglect of Africa was the Sunday school lessons with all those white angels. And when they said God is love, God is kind, God is no respect of kith or kin, I kept wondering, why didn't he let at least one or two little brown or black angels sneak into heaven? So I began to suggest that somebody else had tampered with God's book in favor of somebody else, and that the Bible to a great extent was a rationale for European domination, but had been used as such. Then, coming to, after leaving Georgia, after a white man that I'd worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday, and you personally might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the one thing whites approved of at that time. All right, while doing chores at a local high school, holding the coat and the books of a recitalist, I opened a book called The New Negro, and I found an essay by a Puerto Rican of African descent, Arthur Schomburg. The essay was called The Negro Digs Up His Past. Now I knew I was not only older than slavery, I was older than my oppressor. And my oppressor was the last branch of the human race to enter that arena, marked civilization. Don't get mad, get smart. Prove me wrong. Now, in the Old Harlem History Club, under Willis and Huggins, long since dead, John Jackson, who died only a few years ago, and we had to take up a collection to bury him, Charles Seifert, J. Rogers, under all of these teachers pointing me to good material, and Arthur Schomburg telling me, go study the history of your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Then you'll understand your history. I started on an old chestnut, recently mentioned, H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is still worth reading. It is a good basic outline. His basic facts are in order. When he tells you about the Crusades, he's not off one iota. But his interpretation is basically Eurocentric to the point of being a prejudiced document. Now, I was reading these kinds of books. I was reading Spingarn's Decline of the West when I was 18 years old. So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European curiosity about Africa. Gerald Massey's 6th volume, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion were stolen from outside of Europe. He was not a historian. He was not an Egyptologist. He was an agnostic, fighting the arrogance of the European of that day. See, the History Club led me to not only reading masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents in works written by Europeans. And these works written by Europeans, what black had the time and the money to sit down and do a 6-volume work?
You get to ask Professor Clarke a question.
Yeah. I hardly know where to begin. One thing I'm curious about, I had a quick look actually at the introduction to the 2nd edition of Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, a very interesting book with a lot of interesting hypotheses about the origins of cultures and civilizations. Professor Clarke wrote an introduction to the 2nd edition to it in which he stated that the first show of European literary intelligence surfaced around 1250 BCE with the publication of 2 books of folklore, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that struck me as somewhat curious because, in fact, as far as most scholars seem to be able to tell, the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed actually orally and didn't reach a literary form, if you mean by that a written form, until probably the 6th century BCE in Athens. There are obviously texts from Mycenae and Crete and elsewhere with real Greek in a literary form from before 1250, in fact going back probably to 1600 or so. But this has significant implications for the idea which some scholars have put forth that Egyptian language was deeply influential on the first form of Greek that we have, that is the Linear B tablets.
So I'm awaiting the question.
That is my question. Professor Clarke has stated that this is the first form of literary intelligence that surfaced around 1250, and in fact it did not, and I'm curious how he is maintaining that.
All right.
It is the first book, and it's a book of folklore, and we really don't know whether Homer wrote it or whether Homer was man or woman. It's the first book to become known basic to the West in a form that we could study and conjecture about, and it emerged at the time Europe was beginning to show some intellectual maturity. And if you deal with this, you have to deal with what Professor Leslie accused me of, not paying attention to historical chronology. And if she read any of my texts, any of my numerous guides and curriculars and lecture notes, you know that I'm a specialist on chronology. I know that one comes first and two comes second. But what I was trying to get across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society, Europe intellectually was just being born. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe, because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. Shue lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Gerald Massey, and his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religions, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory, one of the best written books on the Christ story, when he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
I mean,
no one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious.
I don't accept Egypt as Near East. I accept Egypt as physically a part of Africa, created by the Africans from the South.
Even if I concede or admit or agree with you that Egypt is part of Africa, what I'm about to say
There will be order. Thank you. There will be order. Thank you very much.
Do I detect some disagreement?
Yeah.
My point was going to be that the most recent scholarship about the genesis of those two oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, points in fact in another direction to influence, and that is in fact the Hittite Empire, whose documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
Professor Clarke?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, how old is this man? He said, 32. They said, in 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer.
Professor Clarke, would you like to ask Professor Rogers a question? All right, we are waiting. Professor Clarke?
Yes.
It is your turn to ask Professor Rogers a question.
My main concern is that they seem to have equated the civilizations of the Tigris and the Euphrates with the civilization of the Nile. What proof do you have that the civilization of the Tigris and the Euphrates predated the civilization of the Nile?
I don't think that I said that, and I don't think that anyone maintains that. I think the Hittite Empire obviously comes at a much later period.
I know very clear when the Hittite Empire came, I know what damage they did, because I maintain that every people who came into Africa, Greeks, everything from modern day English, everybody that came into Africa did Africa more harm than good.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And that Africa owes nothing to outsiders in regard to development, because all of them declared war on African culture, war on African civilization, war on African ways of life. They began to bastardize Africa and confuse and create a kind of historical schizophrenia that the Africans had even got rid of to this very day. And they created whole words that did not previously exist, like Middle East. Middle from what?
In round two, we will continue. Professor Clarke, you will ask the first question in round two of Professor Mary Lefkowitz.
Well, Professor Lefkowitz, at your own admission, you encountered J.A. Rogers 4 or 5 years ago. J.A. Rogers didn't say he was a historian. He was a searcher trying to find the role of the African personality in world history. He worked over 50 years of his life, gave his service, died broke. What gives you the audacity to think that you can dismiss Rogers out of hand, and what gave you the maturity to think that you can judge a writer like Sheikh Anta Diop, the finest historical writer we have produced in the 20th century?
Sir, deal with that.
I try to ask questions of all the material I read. I try to answer those questions on the basis of the evidence, the historical evidence. It all, in my view, comes down to that. And I do not wish to criticize any individual at all. I am dealing only with written work. The people who write that, I do not always know, and I have no individual or personal criticism of them. This is the way scholars, I'm sure, as you know, proceed, and that is simply what I did in my book. I will leave it to everyone who reads the book to judge what I did.
All right.
Professor Clarke?
I think you have emphasized too much the word black, and we made the same mistake. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture. I did not say Cleopatra was black. I quoted someone else who inferred that. My defense of Cleopatra is not on her blackness, but on no matter whatever she was born in Africa. Her manipulation of Mark Antony and Caesar kept the worst aspect of Roman rule from the backs of Africa. I defend her as an African nationalist. And that's a good defense. And no matter what she did with her wares in and out of bed, there's a whole lot of people got less for it.
Professor Lefkowitz, you may ask a question of Professor Clarke.
Professor Clarke, do you think that we should always judge history in terms of race?
Look, there was no such thing as race in the psyche of the world until the Europeans put it into the psyche of the world. The Africans knew nothing about race and didn't think they belonged to anything called a race. And when the Africans saw the Europeans, because they have a traditional hospitality to strangers, they didn't fight them, they didn't kill, they were curious about them. And with the African explorers, especially Mungo Park, went into Africa, nobody hurt him, nobody shot at him, nobody shot any arrows at him. The Europeans went in peacefully, but the Africans heard that Mungo Park was a pork eater. Most people don't know it, but Africans were not great pork eaters, and they're not great pork eaters today. Pork was a meat you ate in certain ceremonies, certain times a year. But we were not great pork eaters before we came to the United States, or were forced to the United States. But in the United States, we had to eat the part of the pigs that white folks threw away, so we made delicacies out of it and survived. I had this argument with Malcolm X. I said, if it wasn't for the black woman making delicacies out of pig feet, pig heels, guts, chitlins, you and I wouldn't be here arguing the point. I'm afraid that you're not only a delinquent in African history, you're delinquent in African folklore. So much of our history is tied up with our folklore, but Europe has introduced words that didn't exist in anyone's vocabulary before. No one ever thought of anybody being inferior or superior. Intelligent people don't even a human being can't fall into that category. And nobody had the extensive problem the Europeans had with women, because in the period of feudalism in Europe that lasted over 1,000 years, the white woman in Europe was a vassal. Right. But the African woman has never been a vassal in that sense. If you read Sheikh Anta Diop's The Culture Unity of Black Africa, dealing with the history of the matriarch, I mean, he's got all evidence right there that we were the first people to support a woman as head of state. We were the first people to support a woman as riding ahead of her army. We were the first people to make women a god.
But I wanted to follow up on a phrase that you said, and I didn't want to leave it unaddressed, the issue of full disclosure. And it is to that I'd like to ask the question of Professor Lefkowitz. Are you comfortable with the fact, you obviously were comfortable with the fact that your book, Not Out of Africa, subtitled How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History, was underwritten by several foundations that have reportedly rightist leanings. I wondered whether this was a reflection of your own personal or ideological view, or whether you were just so cash-strapped that you took money from anyone.
one tells me what to think, and no one tells me what to say except me, and the main financing of this book was out of my own pocket.
But surely you can appreciate the color of accepting funds from foundations that do not enjoy wide acclaim and receptivity. And I thought that maybe there was some concern on your part, in as much as you were interested in integrity, scholastic integrity and all, that you might have foregone the grants in the interest of academic and scholarly integrity.
If they had asked of me to do anything, I would not have accepted these grants. They did not do that. Therefore, the grants did not go to me. They went to Wellesley College, which had no objection to taking the money.
But still, the question remains. You have a duty, do you not, inasmuch as you are preparing work, the aim of which is to overturn the revisionism, you say, that is going on in black studies, particularly in African studies, this whole battle that you have been dealing with in terms of Afrocentricity. Do you not, regardless of where Wellesley chose to accept money from, do you not, as a scholar, have an obligation to discern where this money is coming from, to see whether the source is compatible with your own views as a scholar?
I did not see anything in the conditions of the grant that inhibited what I did and what I meant to do or say or think. I believe that I acted with perfect integrity. Now, you may disagree with that, and you may disagree with the aims of those foundations and other foundations, and that is what we do in a free country. Until they are outlawed, I don't see what else can be done.
Well, let me ask you the question perhaps more directly. Had there been, say, a foundation to wipe out scholarship of any sort, if such a foundation were to have given money to Wellesley College, would you have found it equally acceptable to take money from such a foundation to further your work?
I don't know what foundation you're talking about. This seems to be a
It was a hypothetical question.
It's totally hypothetical. I don't know what you're trying to force me to say or to compel me into what corner you're tending to put me. If you want to go ahead and attack me, do.
I'm not
That's
forcing
fine.
you to say anything, Professor Lefkowitz. I'm just trying to elicit a cogent response from you.
Well, you be the judge of my response.
All right. Okay, in this last round, before we get to questions, and we will get to questions, but let me warn you, you ought to have questions that are questions, not lectures, and that are straight to the point. In this round, it will be a free-for-all in which all of the discussants are permitted to ask questions of each other and to chime in responses whether they are asked the question directly or not.
Will we have time to sum up afterwards?
Yes, you certainly will.
You treat. I think we should. All right. I just wanted Professor Lefkowitz to know some basic information about the concept of Afrocentricity. There's a lot of people who believe in the African awakening and discovering of their history and their culture who do not accept the word Afrocentricity because it's a compromise with the word African. It's either African centricity or it's nothing. That's right. And if she attacks Afrocentricity as the teacher of myth, have she attacked the nonsense about Columbus discovering America? Because he discovered absolutely nothing, and he committed an act of genocide. He set in motion an act of genocide 10 times worse than the act of genocide in Europe called the Holocaust, as though that was the only Holocaust in the world. That event in Europe was wrong. And even if only 6 people were killed, it was wrong. But it was a matter started in Europe by Europeans that should have been solved in Europe by Europeans.
Oh, anyway.
Oh, you can answer.
I'm sure that you're aware, as we are, that there is a spectrum of Afro and African-centric views. I'm a little bit curious what you think then of the work of Asante, who, as far as I know, does call himself an Afrocentrist. Are you saying that Professor Asante's work actually is flawed conceptually?
I'm saying that all work under the guise of Afrocentrist is not perfect, but it is an earnest effort to restore Africa to a proper commentary in human history. I think Professor Sanchez's work is written too fast, and there's some things he hasn't checked out as well as he need to, and I think too many times Afrocentricity becomes a personality cult, but that don't mean that I'm against African people discovering their history, their literature, their place in the political science of the world. That don't mean that I have not played a role in encouraging people to write about Africans in all the societies of the world. See, your talk keeps telling me what you have not read. You could not have been asking these questions about Afrocentricity if you have not read Anacalypsis, 2 volumes dealing with the massive explosion of African people throughout the whole world. You could not possibly have read with any degree of understanding the 3 volumes, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early Europe, Africans in early America. We're not talking about no hearsay. We're talking about documents. Professor Joseph Harris's book dealing with the global dimensions of the African diaspora. I don't know, I mean, you keep telling me, you keep confessing your ignorance with your questions. You have not read, I'm telling you, before Afrocentricity, radical Europeans had pioneered in this work. Now, I haven't even mentioned the radical black writers that you probably have not read. Now, if you read Chancellor Williams' chapter 2 in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, read that chapter 2 called Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And it deals with the southern African origins of Egypt. If you read a book called Nubia, Corridor to Africa, once more you got it. Also you got the early Arab slave trade. I keep saying nobody came into Africa to do African people any good. After the Romans had disgraced themselves trying to be early Christians, the Africans thought that by accepting Islam, they could get the Romans off of their back. They were right. They did get the Romans off their back, but the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back, and the Arabs are still on their back.
You've conducted, how long have you been, I hate to say this, but how long have you been in this storm?
Sorry.
5 years?
Sorry.
In this area of study?
I think I mentioned at the beginning that my undergraduate training was specifically in Near Eastern ancient history. So that's about 20 years ago at this point.
My undergraduate training is in economics, but I will not exactly say that I would go up against a real economist. It still is a BA degree, after all.
Well, my PhD is actually in classics and ancient history, and I'm curious, now that we're raising the question of qualifications, and you're asking me about judging those texts, whether in fact you do read Greek.
Yes.
Then,
but I'm not at issue here tonight. I'm not at issue.
Then perhaps you would like to tell me that when Herodotus uses the term melanchroes to describe Egyptians, what he means.
I go back to my answer. I'm not here proclaiming to be an expert on Herodotus or any of the so-called Greek philosophers.
But that's a Greek question.
No, it's not a Greek question at all. It is a question that you ask an expert, and I am not here claiming to be an expert. also, in case you would like to know, have a distinction in Latin, and I speak German and French and Spanish, and a distinction in English as well. So I'm somewhat literate. I'm concerned, though, that so far I've been hearing bits and pieces of the discussion in specificity. You take fact A and you argue fact A, and you get a response based on fact A. I'm not so sure, though, that you have accomplished the major objective here tonight, which is to argue that bodies of work have no legitimacy. I would like you, in concluding, to at least get to that issue, that entire bodies of work have no legitimacy.
Are we getting to our conclusions now?
Yes.
I don't know what's wrong.
All right, the order would be as follows. We'll start with Dr. Rogers, and then we will go to Dr. Lefkowitz, to Dr. Bernal, to Dr. Clarke.
I'm baffled by that introduction about bodies of work. I don't think that that has anything to do with anything that either Professor Lefkowitz or I have said. But since you've asked me to conclude something about what we are trying to persuade people of, what I would say is this, that
Excuse me, hold on please. I just don't want you to conclude about something that was not asked. So I would like to document it from the book. You claim, for example, and I'm reading from the cover, the back cover, the contributors to this volume argue that Bernal's claims are exaggerated and in many cases unjustified. You say also in the work, Bernal proposed a radical reinterpretation of the roots of classical civilization, contending that ancient Greek culture derived from Egypt and Phoenicia, and that European scholars have been biased against the notion of Egyptian and Phoenician influence on Western civilization. Since this is a 20-member compendium, I think it suggests that they're attacking a body of work.
I hope that in reading the back jacket cover and our description of Professor Bernal's enterprise, that we've been fair to him insofar as what he takes his project to be about. As far as I understand it, I think it is fair. My conclusion about that has to be framed in terms of what the object of that body of work is about. Professor Bernal says that his object, the cultural purpose, political purpose of Black Athena is to lessen European cultural arrogance. My question is, does it lessen European cultural arrogance to argue that early Greek culture was derived from Egypt and or Phoenicia? If we start out from the premise that we study Egypt or Phoenicia for what they contributed to early Greek culture, my opinion is that we are undervaluing Egypt and Phoenicia. And therefore, the project itself is, in the end, essentially Eurocentric and is its own refutation.
I think one can agree with the project of lessening European cultural arrogance completely, and that we applaud all efforts to do so. What we are concerned with is trying to establish what historical evidence shows the influence of what on what. And this is not a project which any of us here can complete at all. That many people must be involved in this, and it requires the thought and efforts of a lot of us to do it. We would like to think that it can be redone without rewriting history altogether, or without claiming that there has been a huge European cover-up of information. There is certainly true. You can claim that, but please remember, you must also show that it has been done. There are many things that Europe has been guilty of and responsible for, and certainly the covering, not the covering up, I don't mean to say that, but the absolute refusal to acknowledge the history of Africa, which I made reference to in my opening remarks, is something that we must continuously work on redressing. Much more must be learned, much more must be studied. I am very much in favor of that, and I believe that can start also in our teaching of American history, where in many cases the whole history of the African American contribution to American history has been ignored and neglected, and there are brilliant writers out there whose works are not being read. I think we should change all that. But we do not have to rewrite ancient history completely in order to do some of these important things. I would just simply ask, let us investigate carefully the degree of Egyptian influence on ancient Greece, but we must also investigate the Near Eastern cultures such as Phoenicia and the Hittites. After all, Phoenicia gave ancient Greece her alphabet. They didn't learn the alphabet from the Egyptians. It was too hard. It was easier to get it from the Phoenicians. And we must begin to work on those lines. I would like to see everyone work also on a period we haven't discussed much here tonight, where we really do see Egyptian influence on Greek culture, and that is in the Hellenistic period after Alexander got there and Greeks were living in Egypt. A huge number of Greeks were living in Egypt. There I think you can see some real influence.
This is now the third debate that we have had, and I'm very struck by what I see as a discrepancy between Mary Lefkowitz's speech and her writing. That in speech she is all sweetness and light and for open debate and openness in culture. Her writing is very different. The title, Not Out of Africa, is extremely provocative, and it reads, the text carries on in the same way. And I'd like to quote to you a letter I received from probably the most distinguished active classicist in the world today, who actually agrees with her on the academic side. Nevertheless, he writes, "I do not find her exposition cool, detached, and reasonable, despite her efforts to make it seem like that. It is, in fact, as I wrote in my review, an impassioned polemic. Of course, Mary wants to look scholarly and detached, but hers is the scholarship of the National Association of Scholars, which is funded by the same people that funded Not Out of Africa, and that leads us back to where Professor Clarke began on the general political context in which this book has appeared."
I will defend Professor Lefkowitz's innocence because she is a pawn in somebody else's game. As I said in the beginning, it is beyond the lack and dislike of Afrocentricity, which has not even developed enough to be called a discipline. It is a world war to prepare the mind to accept the re-enslavement of Africa, to remove from the mind of all people anything good that the African has done, and to ignore the fact that Europe set up Africa to fall apart by imposing on Africa, through miseducated Africans, a nation state. The nation state is un-African. The African thrived at his best in the territorial state. Many cultures, many languages, side by side, challenging each other, fertilizing each other. What you might call an empire, if you study the last 1,000 years before slavery, the development of independent states in the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, Songhay, destroyed by the invasion from North Africa by the Arabs attacking the North African Muslims, attacking the African Muslims, and destroying the great university of Sankore and exiling its greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, who admonished his students, believe in God and science. The Africans never separated God from science. The priest was scientists. The priest was the most knowledgeable person. That's why you had the concept of a priest God. Now, if they wipe this out of the mind of our children, and our children look at television and sound bites and think they were nothing but a nothing, when they re-enslave Africa, they're going to say, good Father. They're preparing us to accept it. They're preparing the world to accept the re-enslavement of African people all over the world. And I'm saying that Ms. Leskowitz is a pawn in their game, in the tragic irony of it. She is the pawn in the game of people who turn their backs on her people and let them be killed by the millions. American intelligence, French intelligence, British intelligence, the intelligence of the Western world knew exactly what was happening to the Jews in Germany. We raised our voice against this in the old Harlem History Club, 1939 to the death of the leader in 1941. If you think that, if we get into the nonsense about black anti-Semitism, blacks have always had a sentimental attachment to the Jews. They actually believe the Bible. You know, we are the true believers. We out-Pope the Pope, we out-Muhammad Muhammad. But religion has always been a political thing to Europeans, and still is. And when it no longer serves them politically, they're going to discard it. They turn their backs and let this happen. Now they're creating a new game because Europe has spoiled Europe. They want to take some geography outside of Europe. They say the people they're going to take the geography from are unworthy. They can't rule themselves. Of course, they cannot rule themselves in artificial states set up by the Europeans. First thing Africa has to do is to get rid of these borders. Reestablish the borders along the old lines and integrate Africans into Africa.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are. It pleases me to see this perspective that Dr. John Henrick Clarke gives, because for the longest time, even if we had people who stood for black people, we didn't get this arena to debunk these issues, to talk about these issues that are affecting black people. All the credit white people took and gave and put themselves, the inventions, name all these things. But it is time we had black leaders who stood with black people, who talked about these issues that I feel like it's important. And hey, The bone of contention, the primary issue was there was a racial and cultural identity of ancient Egypt. Now, while Dr. John Henrick Clarke was trying to give Afrocentric view, Dr. Clarke argued that ancient Egypt was fundamentally an African civilization, both culturally and racially. He believed that Egypt's achievements, such as its architecture, art, science, and governance, stemmed from African ingenuity connected to the broader content's history. Another thing, we are getting to see we're getting to see Clarke's effort to detach Egypt from Africa as a deliberate whitewashing by Western academics to deny the centrality of black contributions to human civilization. That's what they're always trying to do, right? They're trying to detach Egypt from black, to not show African civilization, to not show the contribution that melanated people did to the world, to not show the contributions, the great things that melanated people have done for the longest time. Now, I'm going to be talking about what Dr. John Henrick Clarke posits. Dr. John Henrick Clarke posits that for us to understand ancient Egypt, an African civilization is crucial for African descendant people reclaiming their historical legacy and self-esteem. Now, I'm going to be taking you back to the argument of these two professors, the Eurocentric view, what they feel was an ancient Egypt, because they tried to detach ancient Egypt from Africans' achievement, from black people's achievement. And now this is what he said. The stand of the two white professors, this is the Eurocentric view that I gave. Now, many white historians argue that the ancient Egypt was distinct from sub-Saharan Africa, and that it had more connections to the Mediterranean world, i.e. the Middle East and Europe. And now they continue by arguing that some claim that even if Egypt was geographically in Africa, its people were not racially black, in the way Afrocentric scholars claimed, often portraying Egyptians as racially mixed or Caucasians. Tell me what to think about this. Do you agree with the posit of these two professors on what they said? I want to know, because it's really important, because we are getting to learn that we are living in more of a whitewash society. We are living in more of a society that the history, the person who has the pen and the paper, wrote their own part of story. They didn't say the truth. It said that they were lied to, or they deliberately decided to lie in the face of the world. Now, this perspective denied the links between Egypt's civilization and other African societies, suggesting that instead that Egypt was culturally isolated or even developed from external, that's non-African influences. Now, what are the key points from all this discussion? The key points that I took from all this discussion is the race of ancient Egypt that Dr. Henrick Clarke talks about. Now, Clarke's argument, Clarke and other Afrocentrists highlights historical records, that's in art and writing, that depicted Egyptians as distinctly in Africa appearance. He cited evidence from Greek historians like Herodotus, who described the Egyptians as black-skinned with holy hair, to support his claims, which is true. What were the white historians' argument? The opposition often pointed the Egyptian art showing a variety of skin tones, or focused on skeletal studies, claiming this indicated a mixed population. They also emphasized Egypt's ties to the Middle East and Mediterranean, framing Egypt as culturally distinct from sub-Saharan Africa. Right. That was their argument, because all of the argument was trying, all along, what they were trying to do, they were trying to detach Egypt and Egyptians from Africans. Yet what Dr. John Henrick Clarke was trying to show them, he gave them proof that, you see, these people, through writings, hieroglyphics, and all those forms of writing that Egypt came with, the civilization of writing, mathematics, right, arithmetics, it proved that it came from Africa. The wild civilization, everything that we are having today, proved that we came from Africa. All these people came from Africa, right? Now, cultural continuity with Africa. That's the second key point on the debate that we are also going to look. Now, what was the Clarke's perspective in regards to this? He stressed that Egypt was deeply tied to the rest of the world, particularly Nubia, Ethiopia, and other civilizations along the Nile. Clarke argued that cultural practices, for example, religion, governance in Egypt mirrored those found across ancient Egypt. On the other hand, the opposing perspective, white historians often downplayed this connection, focusing instead on Egyptian ties to Mesopotamia and to the Mediterranean. Some viewed Egypt as exemption to what they deemed the underdeveloped state of the rest of Africa. That's how crazy they deemed or they viewed Egypt in Africa, underdeveloped state of Africa. Now, the importance of the narrative. Clarke's view argued that the detaching Egypt from Africa was part of larger effort to undermine black history and to deny black people a sense of pride in their contributions to global civilization. He believed that whitewashing Egypt fed into a narrative of African inferiority. Another thing that these white historians' view was many white scholars rejected this framing, accusing Afrocentrists like Clarke of revisionism. They claimed their interpretation were objective and based on science, while Afrocentrism was seen as political motivated. What was the impact of all this debate? Why was this debate important? Now, legacy of Clarke's stand. Clarke's argument empowered Afrocentric scholarship, inspiring movements to reevaluate African history and African perspective. He emphasized how historical narratives shapes identity and warned against accepting histories written by those in power, as they often serve political purposes. This leaves us with criticism and opposition. Many critics have accused white historians of using outdated racial classification and perpetuating Eurocentric biases in academia. Right. The failure to fully contextualize Egypt within Africa continues to face scrutiny, as some more modern studies support deeper African roots in Egypt's early history. Right. Now, all this, the debate highlights not just a clash over historical facts, but also over whose perspective controls the narrative. Dr. Clarke fought for an inclusion of African agency and centrality in world's history, while the white historian resisted revising a narrative they viewed as traditional or scientific. This intellectual battle remains a foundational discussion in re-examining global history, particularly as it pertains to race, identity, and power. Tell me what you think about this video. I hope it was so refreshing. I hope it reminds you the late Dr. John Henrick Clarke. May his soul rest in peace. We still appreciate his works. We still appreciate his effort. We still appreciate everything that he did to melanated people across the world. But until then, I'm hoping to see you in my next video. Until then, you know how we do it. Peace, love, and harmony. And hey, just a reminder, if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. We'll most definitely appreciate. Until then, peace, love, and harmony.